Thank you. I told Clint I used to teach at the University of Utah, and I'm much more comfortable if people ask questions while I'm talking. That way I know if I'm boring you or not. And so it's a little dark out there, but if you raise your hand and wave at me, I should be able to see it. If I don't see it, just yell at me. And with that, I'll try and get started. The Alliance for Wild Rockies mission is to protect habitat for native species in the Northern Rockies. And as Clinton said, the best habitat for native species are unlogged forest. Politicians like to talk about healthy forest, but if you ask a politician what a healthy forest is, a lot of times they can't tell you. The Forest Service says a healthy forest is a forest that's most resilient to wildfire and insects. But unfortunately, you can't fireproof a forest, nor should you. As Jack Cohen, who ran the fire lab at the University of Montana for the Forest Service, he has a PhD in fire, I guess. And he said that forests have evolved for the last 10,000 years with fire. And in the Northern Rockies, we have crown replacing fires. So the entire forest burned down like Yellowstone did in 1988. And that's not a bad thing, is what he says, that fires, if you have a hot fire that burns the entire forest, it creates new habitat. A burnt forest has more different species in it than a live forest, believe it or not. If you ever go to a crown fire the summer after it's burned, it's just shocking how quick it starts to regrow. And Yellowstone is a perfect example. You know, I'm sure lots of you have been there since 1988, and Yellowstone, like when it burned, everybody was saying, oh, the fire was so hot it was going to sterilize the soils and nothing would live there forever. Well, obviously that's not true. You know, millions of people go to Yellowstone every year still. And so our vision to protect habitat and have healthy forest is in the Northern Rockies Ecosystem is the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act. And it was developed by scientists like John Craighead. John and his brother Frank were named by National Geographic as two of the top 100 scientists of the 20th century for their work studying grizzly bears in Yellowstone Park. And what scientists like the Craighead figured out is for species to survive in the long run, we need to protect ecosystems. Places like Yellowstone Park aren't big enough for a species to survive in the long run, and even the greater Yellowstone ecosystem isn't big enough. And we need to protect the entire Northern Rockies ecosystem. And the work was started by a scientist named E.O. Wilson at Harvard. He studied island biogeography, and he found out the bigger the island, the more species that were there. And then other scientists like William Newmark of the University of Utah Museum of Natural History, he studied national parks in the Intermountain West and discovered the bigger the park was, the more native species were there. But again, parks aren't big enough to ensure that species will survive over the long run. And he explained it to me once, well, imagine if you live in a town of 500 people and there's no interchange with other people. You don't, marry outside of that town. You end up marrying your cousins all the time. And so guess what happens after a few generations? Everybody has 12 fingers and 12 toes, and they all play banjos. So it's just inbreeding is not good, right? People or animals can't survive if they become inbred. And so grizzly bears, they decided was a good species, that if you can protect habitat for grizzly bears, you're protecting habitat for all the other native species in the Northern Rockies. And so it starts with you have to protect the core areas, and the core areas in the Northern Rockies are the existing wilderness areas and the national park. So we have Yellowstone National Park and the existing wildernesses around Yellowstone and Grand Teton. And then you have Glacier and the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And then in central Idaho, I have a pointer here, we have the Frank Church and Selway Wilderness. And then up in northwest Montana, we have the Cabinet Yaak Ecosystem. There's not any parks or wilderness there, and so coincidentally, it's the smallest grizzly bear population in the world that's isolated, and guess what? They have inbreeding problems. And then we have in the Idaho Panhandle is the the Selkirk grizzly population. So the idea is to connect all these separate populations using the existing roadless areas. And then, so for example, coming out of Yellowstone, there's this corridor here coming up through the Absaroka Wilderness and then going into the Castle Mountains and up through the Little Belt Mountain Range, and then over to the top of the Big Belts and up to the Bob Marshall. And we have another corridor coming here out of the northwest corner of Yellowstone up through the Gallatin Range, up through the Big Belts, and then finally another corridor coming out of Yellowstone along the Continental Divide, along the Idaho-Montana border, up over to central Idaho, and then also follow the Continental Divide up into there. And then there's existing corridors coming down from the Cabinet Yaks into Idaho, and one from the Cabinet Yaks across to Glacier. So these light green areas are all the existing roadless areas. And so they would be declared wilderness. And as Clint said, all of these existing roadless areas, if the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act would designate them as wilderness. Their existing roadless areas are de facto wilderness now. We're not creating new wilderness, we're just protecting the wilderness that's de facto wilderness. And then finally, to get to the full 23 million, the Glacier and Yellowstone, I think in the late 1970s, recommended large parts of both park to be designated and managed as wilderness, so we just took their recommendations and put those in the bill as well. And so it's in the Senate right now. Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island has introduced it in the current Congress. But guess what? It's not going anywhere right now. I read an article the other day that the Republicans in the House are worrying how they're going to campaign for re-election because they haven't done anything. They can't even agree as a party what to do, so they pretty much haven't passed any bills at all. And so in the meantime, to still protect these areas, here's a short video that kind of will start us off.
100, 1 1/4, 1 1/2, 170.
The last of the native forest.
3, 3 1/4, 3 1/2, 375 4, 4 1/4, 4 1/2, 475 5 1/4.
The last wild river.
3 1/4, 3 1/2, 375 4, 4 1/4, 4 1/2, 475 5 1/4, 5 1/2.
The last of the wilderness. The dreams of our children, solitude, freedom, and hope. Going once, going twice.
Only a few hundred years ago, wildlands reached from coast to coast and from the Arctic to the tropics. Wildlife roamed in abundance. Now the abundance is gone, the web of life torn. Extinction of species no longer is surprising news. Today, there is only one bioregion left in the lower 48 states where we still find virtually all native wildlife species, the wildlands of the Northern Rocky Mountains. Vast stretches of undeveloped public land make the Northern Rockies the last refuge for animals long gone from the rest of the country. Up to now, the region's wildness and remoteness has safeguarded these survivors from extinction. Spanning 5 states and 2 Canadian provinces, the Northern Rockies Wildland Complex is composed of 5 greater ecosystems: the Cabinet Yaak Selkirk, the Glacier Continental Divide, Yellowstone, Salmon Selway, and the Hells Canyon Wallowa. These public lands are owned by all Americans and are managed by the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and the National Park Service. Once an intact system, these public wildlands are rapidly shrinking and becoming more and more isolated from each other. Roading, logging, mining, oil and gas development, and livestock grazing are endangering these ecosystems. The habitat on which wildlife is so utterly dependent is being altered and tamed. Are we as a nation willing to save this last remnant of the real America?
We put this in because it's a pretty picture, and aspen are one of the species that are in decline. But I'll explain more about that in a minute. I just want to first say, to talk more about the ecosystems, and Bill Newmark, what he was explaining to Congress at one of the hearings where I testified with him is the U.S. was once a leader in the world in conservation. Yellowstone was the world's first national park when it was designated in 1872, is that correct? And now over 100 countries around the world have national parks. But this would be the first ecosystem that would be created. And so if NREPA does eventually become law, we could once again become one of the world's leaders in conservation. We're in the, I'm sure you know, we're in the middle of the world's 6th great extinction period. And what conservation biologists say is the Northern Rockies is one of the few places where we have a chance of stopping the 6th great extinction period, because we still have all these intact wildlands. So that's why it's so important we can try and do it here, because there's really nowhere else in the United States where we could do it, and very few places in the world. And because NREPA is not passing right now, the way we're trying to defend these wildlands is mostly through lawsuits. The Congressional Research Office or Service did a study several years ago about who sues the Forest Service. The Alliance for the Wild Rockies sued the Forest Service more than anybody else in the country. So, you know, compare us to big groups like the Wilderness Society or the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club is the biggest environmental group in this country. I don't know how many employees they have, but I'm sure it's in the thousands. So we sue more than they do, but we don't just sue by ourselves. As Clinton said, we sue with other grassroots groups. Alliance was created to be an alliance of grassroots group where we work together when we agree on something, we don't when we disagree. So that's why it's non-hierarchical. You know, we're not telling each other what to do. We just, if it's something we oppose, we work together to sue, so we're not all hiring individual attorneys and all trying to, you know, reinvent the wheel. So it's much more efficient to do it that way. Sorry, yes? Can you wave your hand again so Shirley can see you?
So I was wondering if you could go back to the map that showed the bright green area. So my question is, a couple questions. The bright green area is part of this Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, so that's expanding that area? Do I understand that correctly? So, this? Yeah, but it's all, there's a lot of bright green all over.
Correct. Those are existing roadless areas.
So that's wilderness area that exists right now that's owned by the federal government?
It's mostly Forest Service land. Some of it is BLM land. And it's, in 1999 or 2000, Mike Dombeck was the head of the Forest Service. And through, you know, after vast public comment, he signed what they called the roadless rule. And it was designed to protect all roadless areas, inventoried roadless areas in national forests, and then the BLM has similar ones. Because he thought if, you know, to have healthy forests, we have to leave roadless areas roadless. And so they're de facto wilderness. The problem is the roadless rule isn't really strong enough to permanently protect them. The Forest Service is constantly trying to log roadless areas. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, because I was trying to understand if it's already wilderness area, then what's the problem with saying, okay, we want it to continue to be wilderness area, and so why can't it pass? So I guess what you're saying is the Forest Service has other things that they want to do with this, whether it's logging or mining, or there's other things that might happen in these bright green areas and that's that's holding up getting agreement to be able to pass the act?
That's correct. And they're de facto wilderness. You know, so as far as the animals are concerned, they're wilderness, but they're not officially wilderness like the Bob Marcher wilderness or the Frank Church wilderness or the Zorka Beartooth wilderness. Another question?
Yes, Mike, this is a question dealing with international treaties between Canada and the United States to provide corridors for wildlife, particularly our larger carnivores, to keep basically genetic diversity flowing through the entire area. Have we done that yet? Have we basically gotten together with Canada? Because they have large areas in Canada that are part of the Northern Rocky Mountain system as well.
You're right, and ideally, the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act would reach into Canada, but, you know, we can't designate things in Canada. No, I know you know that, I'm just...
But what I'm saying is if there was genuine cooperation between our different governments, maybe we could set up something like that. What I was seeing in Europe, when they're trying to rewild some areas and reintroduce extinct species or in certain areas, they're having quite a bit of success because they're cooperating with each other. And I think we could do that here.
We could do that. In my opinion, I think it's more of a feel-good measure for politicians to make points rather than
Right.
on-the-ground reality. The Western Governors Association also proclaimed several years ago that we need to protect corridors throughout the West. But how many governors do you know who are doing anything to actually do that? The Montana governor doesn't seem to
No.
want to protect any corridors.
And my second question has to deal with the livestock industry, which I hold responsible for a lot of what's going on right now.
Almost no industry wants to designate wilderness. Wilderness is all about no commerce, essentially.
Correct.
And so an industry is all about commerce, so almost anybody, if any industry is against our bill.
Right, and the other thing is, grizzly bears originally were not only in the mountain regions, but they were throughout the plains.
Yeah, well, grizzly bears are now, this year, they discovered a grizzly bear out here. So it's
Correct.
made it all the way out here, and when Lewis and Clark first came here, the most grizzly bears they saw were in the plains. But
Yes.
I'll get to grizzly bears later, if that's okay.
Thank you, Mike.
Sure. So I'll
100.
go back. So aspen, in relation to your question about why we're having trouble getting Naripa Pass, I think aspen is a good example, and the cattle industry. Aspen are in decline. The Forest Service blames it on fire suppression. But the best available science, meaning peer-reviewed published scientific papers, say aspen are in decline because of cattle grazing. Cattle eat the new aspen. Aspen regenerate themselves by putting up new shoots. And aspen groves are one organism. The biggest organism in the world is a giant aspen grove in central Utah in the Fish Lake National Forest called Panda, I think. And it's just one organism. But a group called Western Watersheds Project set up a camera one summer, and deer and elk did graze on some aspen. But for 2 weeks every summer, cattle were herded through this aspen grove. And in those 2 weeks, aspen ate 90% of the aspen shoots of all the aspen shoots that were eaten. So 10% were eaten by deer and elk, and 90% over the whole course of the whole year. The cattle ate 90% of it in 2 weeks. And so the Forest Service's solution to this problem, guess what? It's their solution to everything. It's logging. If there's a problem, the answer is always logging. And so they want to clear-cut aspen groves. And here, the founder of the Alliance is Mike Bader, and here's a short video, both this and is part of the video I showed you earlier. It's called Beyond Borders. It was created about 30 years ago, and the same problems we were having back then we're still having today.
The problem that we have today with our land management is that we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to prevent the extinction of the Pacific salmon, the grizzly bear, the gray wolf, the woodland caribou, and on and on. But at exactly the same time, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars subsidizing the destruction of their last remaining habitat, so that what we're actually doing is paying to destroy America's public lands. It doesn't make economic sense, it doesn't make environmental sense, it isn't saving our jobs, our wildlife, or our water. It doesn't make any sense at all.
So unlogged forests are the healthiest. I mean, essentially because forests have been here for 10,000 years. And the Forest Service wasn't created until Teddy Roosevelt created it in, I think, 1898, somewhere around then. So it's just shocking that all these species survived for 9,850 years without the Forest Service managing them. And the species that are in decline are the ones that really need these unlogged forests. One of the problems with logging is you have to build logging roads. The Montana Wilderness Association, when they were supporting the roadless rule in 1988, created this map, and the red shows all the roads in Montana. And so we don't really have a shortage of roads. You know, the Forest Service says, well, we need roads to manage the fire and then manage the forest to log them. And then after the logging is done, we need roads to go in and fight fires. But, you know, it's amazing they have to build any new roads after seeing this map. So what happens when a forest is fragmented by logging and road building is it destroys habitat. So you asked about grizzly bears. The limiting factor in grizzly bear numbers is people. Most grizzly bears are illegally killed by people, and most of them are killed within 1/3 of a mile of a road. David Madsen, a grizzly bear scientist who lives just outside of Livingston, he explained it to me once that it's a crime of opportunity. There's not a lot of grizzly bears killed in places like the Bob Marshall or Glacier, because to kill a grizzly bear, you generally need a big gun. And it's hard to hike through an unlogged forest looking for a grizzly bear with a big gun. They're heavy and you know, you can't see that far because all those darn trees are in the way. And so that's, you know, in the Cabinet Yaak, where I said is the smallest grizzly bear population, the Kootenai National Forest is the wettest forest in Montana. So coincidentally, it has always been the most heavily logged forest. And grizzly bears in the Cabinet Yaak, the Fish and Wildlife Service said it should be uplisted from threatened to endangered because it's at extreme risk for extinction. The cabinet portion of the Cabinet Yaak they think is now inbred. And they keep trucking in grizzly bears there, and when the grizzly bears get there, first thing they want to do is try and head home. And so a lot of them get killed trying to run back home. If they stay there, they're often killed by another bear who they dump the grizzly bear in another bear's territory. They have different food from what they're used to, and the vast majority of them don't successfully reproduce. So that's one reason we focus on grizzly bears. The other is, I think grizzly bears is one of the reasons that make Montana special. I mean, we have, you know, more grizzly bears than any other state in the lower 48. It really, you know, it makes an area wild, right? If there's a grizzly bear out there, it's a big difference than like hiking through. The Forest Service always wants to talk about, they want to make forest park-like. Well, it's a different experience hiking through grizzly bear habitat than it is hiking through a city park. I guess in a city park it can be just as dangerous because someone could mug you and shoot you, but I don't really consider that wild. Another species we focus on is bull trout. The Alliance sued to get bull trout listed as a threatened species. It took 8 different lawsuits to do that. So as you can tell, we're very persistent. My ex-wife told me I'm the most persistent person she ever met. I took it as a compliment. I don't know if she meant that. But bull trout need very clean, cold water. So when you log and clear cut and build logging roads, it puts sediment into streams, and bull trout decline when you do that. So again, the healthiest bull trout populations are in unlogged forest. And if water is clean enough for bull trout, it's also clean enough for people. Lynx are another species we focus on. Lynx also avoid roads, but when the Forest Service is really big right now on saying we have to log to make forests more resilient to wildfire. And so they either clear cut or what they call thin a forest, where they cut down most of the trees or remove the understory. Lynx eat snowshoe hare as their main prey. Snowshoe hare, to make it through the winter, need very thick understory. So understory is like if you walk through, it's, the growth down low. So an old growth forest often has a very thick understory. You have a lot of branches at ground level, or you have big old trees, but dead trees leaning on other trees, and then young trees coming up. So you can't see very far in a mature old growth forest. But that's the best habitat for lynx. And if you thin the forest, then all the snowshoe hare get eaten very quick, so they don't last. And then the lynx either starve or they're not able to reproduce. And there's a lynx scientist who works at a Forest Service research station in Missoula. His name is John Squires. For years, he studied lynx in the Garnett Range just outside of Missoula. It's north of I-90 as you get closer to Missoula, and the northern border is Highway 200. And he said there have been lynx in the Garnett Range since the last ice age until about 2010. And what happened in 2010, the BLM, who manages the Garnett Range, logged around Garnett Ghost Town to prevent the ghost town protect it from wildfires. And they also logged in an area called Union Peak. Well, both of these areas had mature and old growth forests, so they thinned them out, and then after they did that, they never found lynx there again. And John Squires thinks that the lynx will never come back. And yes?
I have a question. I work in fire, and I'm not for logging, but fire does play an important role in getting rid of the understory, which is so overgrown now because fire has been suppressed for so long. And in my question, the best way to manage forests is to prescribe burning, because a lot of fires are driven by that overgrown understory, which is not natural, because our ecosystems were used to having frequent fires, but not large conflagration fires like we're getting today.
When talking to Jack Cohen, that's where I learned that he wants to focus the efforts you're talking about around homes. And so as far as thinning the understory, and what he said, the only hard rock science for preventing fires is in what he called the home ignition zone, and where you want to start with the home and have things like a non-flammable roof and a non-flammable deck, and not have firewood stacked up next to your home or propane tank right next to the home, and then work out from there, and not have any vegetation within the first 5 feet of the house, and then prune trees as you work out to no more than 100 feet. And he was able to study this because they would actually, build houses and test it out. So they could test with the scientific method. And the Forest Service does tell everybody that because of fire suppression, forests are unnaturally thick. I work very closely with Sarah Johnson. She's a former Forest Service wildlife biologist. She has a PhD in biology from MSU. And I've been with her on many field trips where the Forest Service tells her that the forests are unnaturally thick, and she always gets them to reverse themselves. And she said, well, they only grow as thick as the conditions allow. There's no such, a tree wouldn't grow there if it wasn't natural. And they eventually back down. So it's my opinion that there's no such thing as a unnaturally thick forest. And these thick forests are what lynx depend on. And so if we go and remove the understory, then, as they did in Garnet Mountains, then the lynx disappear. And lynx are really in trouble. Their numbers are continuing to decline. The only place in Montana they're doing well is in the Purcell Mountain Range in the Kootenai National Forest, because it rains so much, so the understory is thick there. But in the rest of the Northern Rockies, the numbers are falling. And so lynx were listed in what I think 1999. At the time, Montana Fish and Wildlife and Parks estimated they were opposing listing lynx. And they said there was like 1,100 to 1,500 lynx in Montana. Now we have about 300. So all of this logging to remove the understory is going to drive lynx to extinction. And when they listed lynx, they had to amend all the forest plans to involve protections for lynx. So it's called the Northern Rockies Lynx Management Direction, or the Lynx Amendment. And this Lynx Amendment allows up to 30% of lynx habitat to be clear-cut, and it allows unlimited amount of logging in the wildland-urban interface, and the Forest Service in some places is calling entire counties the wildland-urban interface. And we just won a case in the Ninth Circuit in a 3-judge panel. 2 of the judges were Trump-appointed judges, where we sued on a timber sale in the Idaho Panhandle National Forest, where the county and the Forest Service declared the entire county the wildland-urban interface, and these 3 judges said they have to follow the statutory definition of the wildland-urban interface found in the Healthy Forest Act, which is 1.5 miles from a community, and a community is defined as at least 40 houses per square mile with common infrastructure with things like sewers, sidewalks, lighted streets. So it's my contention that if we continue to remove understory everywhere, species like lynx will go extinct. But here's an example. This is in the 10-mile watershed. It's Helena's drinking watershed. There's Governor Bullock. Next to him is John Tubbs, who was his head of Department of Natural Resources. This is Leanne Martin, the head of Region 1. Steve, do you remember his name? This is Robert Bonney, who was at the time the Undersecretary of Agriculture under Obama, in charge of the Forest Service. Now he's under Biden. He works again for the Department of Agriculture, but he's in charge of climate change. But if you can see, they're proudly standing in front of this clear cut to protect this reservoir. Is the reservoir that stores the water for Helena. That's a big feller buncher, I guess, or a big cat that moves the logs around. You can see the big chains on the tires. So they're obviously very proud of this clear cut. And politicians regularly say they don't clear cut anymore. And the Forest Service tells us the same thing. So I just wanted to show you this clear cut to say that's not true. Here's a example that most of you know, Kirk Hill, just outside of Bozeman. The Forest Service logged this for fire protection. And so, as I said earlier, since NAREPA is not passing right now, we sue. And we sue with lots of other small groups like Clint's group, the Gallatin Wildlife Alliance. And politicians like Governor Gianforte and Senator Daines tell the media that we sue because I get rich doing it. And so that's why took my Learjet from Helena to come down here and got a chauffeured limousine from the airport to this museum. But when Congress wrote these environmental laws, they created an enforcement provision. And the way they decided to enforce it was they decided to let citizens enforce the law. So if someone throws a rock through your window, you call the police and the police can go charge them. And there's a county attorney who would prosecute them. With the federal government, they allowed citizens to sue the federal government if they think they're breaking the law. And as an incentive to do that, if they win, the government has to pay their attorney's fees. I'm not an attorney. The Alliance doesn't have any staff attorneys. So unfortunately, I really don't have a Learjet, and I don't make any money when we sue. If we sue, the attorneys get paid if they won. And the Congress just thought that was a much more efficient way to do it rather than create a federal police force to go around and arrest Forest Service or whatever government agencies when they think they're breaking the law. But the main way they did this is through the Equal Access to Justice Act. That's how they pay attorneys' fees. But the vast majority of those are paid out to people suing because they don't think they're getting the right Social Security check, or a veteran not getting the benefits they're retired because of their health problems when they served. The Bridger Range, threw that in here since it's close to Bozeman. It's one of the corridors coming out of Yellowstone to the Northern Continental Divide. Here's another pretty picture of a lynx. A lot of people get lynx and bobcats confused. You can mainly, tell the difference because of the tufts. No, I lost where I was. The tufts on top of the ears. And they're bigger, and they have much longer legs than a bobcat, so they can get through really deep snow. We also focus and we work with the Gallatin Wildlife Association on this, trying to protect wild buffalo or bison. We have a lot of buffalo in this country, but most of them are on essentially game farms. But Montana passed an initiative in the 1990s, I believe, outlawing game farms. So we still have a few, but they were grandfathered in. Buffalo, people are allowed to have game farms for buffalo because in Montana they're classified as livestock. And who was the scientist who died recently, Jim Bailey did a lot of work, and he educated me about why it's important to have wild buffalo. And in the wild, if you have a animal that's can't make it through a tough winter, it dies. So the gene pool, manages itself to have, so only the strongest survive. And so they're wild, and they do things like migrate. And in Gardner, I think most people know about elk winter range. In the winter, elk come down out of the mountains where the snow isn't deep and eat at lower elevations, and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and the Forest Service are supposed to protect elk winter range. And so all the bison we're trying to do in Gardner last winter is come down to their winter range, and they were slaughtered as soon as they stepped into Montana. And that's what happened. This is Glacier Park. There's bull trout there.
The fate of our wildlands is in our hands. Future generations are depending on us to take a new course in land conservation and protect this remnant of the real America.
So, in conclusion, this came up again. So it's just, if we want species to survive over the long run, we have to protect an ecosystem. And that's what we're trying to do. And one of the places we're suing on right now that is right south of West Yellowstone. I guess it's a little far south than right here. The Forest Service has a timber sale that Clint's group is also suing on called South Plateau. And they want to log 9,000 acres with 4,800 acres of clear cuts. And right literally up to the border of Yellowstone. And it's the same excuse. The forests are unnaturally thick, and if we don't do this, West Yellowstone will burn down. And if they do it, then the forest will be more resilient to wildfire and insects. I don't really understand how clear-cutting a forest can make it more resilient. It just makes the forest disappear. But to haul all those logs out, they have to build 56 miles of roads. And the South Plateau area in the entire greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it's the worst sink for grizzly bears, meaning more grizzly bears get killed there than are born there. So in this entire huge ecosystem of the greater Yellowstone, which actually is bigger, the worst part is South Plateau because of the past logging and logging roads that were there. So we're suing this. The Congress passed something called the National Environmental Policy Act, and the whole purpose of it was to make the government look before it leaps and take public input about what the government wants to do. So, I think almost everybody agrees that democracy works best when it's transparent. Well, with South Plateau, the Forest Service is violating the National Environmental Policy Act. They're not telling the public where they're going to log or where they're going to build roads or where they're going to burn. And so somehow we're just supposed to say, okay, good job. But you and I have to follow the law. If we don't, we get arrested. So we expect the Forest Service to follow the law too, especially right next to Yellowstone. And I don't want West Yellowstone to burn down, but again, the best available science, published science, says the way to protect homes is in the home ignition zone, 100 feet out from a home or a business. And if they log all of this and they don't do anything in the home ignition zone, Jack Cohen says homes are just as likely to burn down because embers can travel for a long ways. And fires still burn through clear cuts because there's a lot of weeds there after they log, and it'll burn right through a clear cut and then burn down the next patch of trees. So that fire could send embers into West Yellowstone, and it could land, on a roof of a house that isn't a non-flammable roof or in a tree right next to a house and then burn down that house. And what Jack Cohen has found is that in a town like Paradise, California, which was also heavily logged all around Paradise, California, once a house catches on fire, it burns really hot, and the embers from that fire then burn down the neighbor's house and on, and then before you know it, the whole town's burned down. So fire scientists like Jack Cohen says it won't protect West Yellowstone. So all it will do is the Forest Service, Congress just gave the Forest Service $23 billion on top of their $6 billion annual budget for more logging and burning to fight wildfires. And so more grizzly bears will get killed, more lynx habitat will be destroyed. Wolverines were just listed. Wolverines also try to avoid people. So the habitat for wolverines will be bad. Goshawks are another species that need thick, unlogged forests. Goshawks can fly through really narrow openings and turn really sharp corners. So they nest in mature and old-growth forest. And if you thin out a forest and remove the understory, their competitors, which are great gray owls and red-tailed hawks, move in. Great gray owls eat goshawk chicks. Red-tailed hawks drive the goshawks out. Goshawks are another species in decline. We won a timber sale. We stopped a timber sale in the Castle Mountains, which are about 80 miles north of here. They wanted to log the entire Castle Mountain range, including the roadless areas, and build logging roads there. And it's in the Lewis and Clark portion of the Helena Lewis and Clark National Forest. And they are required under their old forest plan to tell the public if goshawk populations are declining more than 10% a year, and they were doing that for like the past, I don't know, 8 or 10 years. So the goshawk population was quickly disappearing, and it was mainly due to the logging because their habitat was being destroyed. So that was one of the species that I don't have a picture of. Again, that's what makes Montana unique, is we still have almost all the native species we had when Lewis and Clark first arrived. Yes?
Congress mandated that the Forest Service cut X number of board feet per year. Has that changed at all?
Congress didn't mandate that. It was mandated in their forest plan. Well, not mandated. They have something called allowable sale quantity, and it's not a mandate. It's just like how much they're allowed to log. But Congress essentially mandates it when they give them all this money. And so they have timber targets. Forest Service won't admit it to it very often, but some supervisors have. The regional office will have a target, and they divide it up among each forest. And essentially, if you want to, what I've been told, if you want to, move up in your job or keep your job, you have to meet your target. And what one supervisor told me, his name was Earl Stewart. He was the acting supervisor of the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest, and now he's a supervisor, I think, in New Mexico. He said if they don't meet their target, their budget gets cut, and the amount, so if their target is, say, 20 million board feet, and they only cut 10, then that 10 million board feet they were short gets added to their target the next year, so their target becomes 30 million board feet, but they don't get any money, extra money to do it. So they're penalized if they don't meet their target. But if they sign a decision that they lose on in court, they're not penalized for that. And in my opinion, it seems they're rewarded for it. So there is a lot of pressure on Forest Service supervisors and rangers to get the cutout.
Up here, Mike,
Yes?
up here.
Howdy, Mike. Thanks for being here. There's something new going on with logging as well. I'm trying to think of the term for it, where the Forest Service wants to thin and log along all these road corridors and recreational trails and what have you. Can you talk a little bit about that? For instance, Chestnut Mountain right outside of Bozeman, they want to log all along the trails up there. So that's a whole nother kind of logging scheme they've got going, and I can't think of the term for it.
Well, it's generally what they tell me is for public safety, because they say they want to log dead trees or snags near trails so they don't fall on people and injure or kill them. But I called Yellowstone Park and asked them how many times they did that, and they said we don't. And I said, well, how many people were killed in Yellowstone by falling trees? And at the time there weren't any, but I read later, I think a Japanese tourist was killed. So in this whole time since 1988, as far as I could figure out, one person was killed by a falling tree. And And then they want to log along next to roads for public safety, because if there's a fire there, someone could be, the fire could cross the road and then they're stuck and they die. And, so my background is economics. Part of it, economists like statistics. And what I found out, really the biggest risk to public safety is driving to the trailhead and back. You're most likely to get killed in an automobile accident. And most firefighters are actually killed on highways driving to or from a fire. They get in these vans and they drive down the interstate and drive too fast, and the van will wreck and kill like 8 or 10 firefighters in the van. Yes?
I think more loggers are killed by trees than recreators. But I have a question for you. When I was a young man in eastern Montana.
I'm sorry, where?
In eastern Montana.
Okay, yes.
Along the Yellowstone River.
Yes.
We had different years when there were lots and lots of snowshoe rabbits on the river bottoms. So, which makes me kind of wonder if probably because we had bobcats, for sure, if maybe before, we began trapping them all, that there were probably lynx back there too.
I'm not a biologist, but my understanding from records from Montana FWP is lynx have historically been in the mountains of western Montana, but the grizzly bears have been throughout the state, I said. I'm not aware that lynx were in eastern Montana, but as I said, I'm not a biologist, and I could
Lynx
easily be
are a
wrong.
really rare creature in Montana.
That's correct.
As far as I'm concerned.
But there is a historic relationship between predator and prey. As you said, hare populations go up and down. So scientists have documented when the hare population goes up, the predator population goes up. When the prey population declines, because that's just a natural cycle, then the predator population also declines.
So when the grizzly bear got on the Missouri River and went down it, did he get as far as the CMR?
Yes, that's where it is right now. And
it's living down there now?
Yeah. And it's,
how cool
I
is
think,
that?
I think it's an amazing place for a grizzly bear to be. There's really, the Charles M. Russell Wildlife Management Area is one of the largest wildlife management areas in the lower 48. And there's a lot of elk there. And the American Prairie Reserve owns land on both sides of the Missouri River. They have, 900 bison now that they're genetically pure bison. A lot of these bison on game farms are part cow. If you go to Ted Turner's, I drove past Ted Turner's ranch last summer on the Ruby River, and the bison were the size of cows, but they still looked like bison. Oh. And the problem if you just have 100% pure bison on your game farm, wild bison can jump an 8-foot fence and just tear through a fence. So they use genetics to bring them down to have mini bison, and that's what if you go to Ted Turner's restaurant, which I like to go to and eat bison, you're getting one of these mini bison.
I'll tell you, I ranched for 30 years. I've had cattle that are way wilder than the buffalo in Yellowstone Park.
Now, I'm friends with a rancher outside of Helena, and he sold all his he's just slightly older than me, I'm 62, and he sold all his cattle a couple years ago because one of his bulls almost killed him. He thought, okay, life's too short, I'm done.
So there was another grizzly bear that they killed in the Snowies. And I imagine the genetics come out of Yellowstone Park.
Most of these bears, they find, the one in the CMR, they just got a picture of it on a camera, so they don't they don't know sure where it came from, but they've been moving east from the Rocky Mountain front. So they're almost positive it came from the Rocky Mountain front. And every bear that gets a long ways that they can do DNA analysis on, mostly by finding fur, has come from the northern Continental Divide population. They haven't found, grizzly bears have made it all the way north as far as the tobacco roots, and those bears come from the Yellowstone. But they haven't documented any crossing I-90 from the south yet.
Thank you.
Someone up front has a question, and then this gentleman over here.
Yeah, I am just curious if you've been keeping track of the Biden administration's old growth and mature forests initiative and where things stand with that.
They're taking public comment on it right now, and essentially my comment was, thank you for the proposal. My only criticism was it allows logging of old growth to remove the understory to protect the big trees from wildfire. And the problem is an old growth forest isn't just big trees. It's a very thick forest. And so that's, if they do what they're proposing and allow thinning and prescribed burning of old growth, then it will destroy the habitat for wildlife.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, if I have opportunity through my civic engagement roles where I can sit at a table with public land agency staff and give input on their direction or their projects. What advice do you have on how I might target feedback toward them? Do you see any broad avenues of message that my feedback could take, or is it different forest to forest, project to project?
Well, in the Northern Rockies, the Forest Service complains that I always say the same thing. And what I always say is you need to protect the habitat for the species that are in decline: lynx, grizzly bears, wolverine, goshawk. And to do that, we need to protect mature and old growth forest. And we don't need to log or thin or burn these mature and old growth forests to keep homes from burning down. That's what I say essentially every time. And my suggestion is you do it in writing. If a lot of times the forest likes to have open houses where they say they take public comment, but they don't write it down. So there's no record of you making that comment, and if there's no record, then essentially you never really made a comment. And comments are important. I mean, ultimately, the government is run by politicians, and politicians want to get reelected. And if they see that the public is very much against something, then sometimes the government reverses itself. Or it also helps when someone like me or Clint or someone else sues, because then the judge sees all these comments and starts to question what the Forest Service is saying. The gentleman down here has had his hand up for a long time. Thanks, Shirley.
Hi. You were saying that, at least I'm understanding you to say, that a overly thick natural forest is a contradiction in terms.
Correct.
And I would agree with you, except that it seems like in areas of overzealous fire suppression, overly zealous fire suppression, that you can get forests that are, in a sense, too thick. And fires come through, they kill some of the mature trees, and they clear out the understory fairly, extensively in some cases. And eventually, meadows and understory comes back, and they facilitate those kinds of things and the diversity of habitat that you have there. But I think in areas of overly zealous fire suppression, you can get forests that are too thick, because you will have mature trees that may have receded in a more distant time after a fire, and the reproduction, the young immature trees, come back in great quantity, and they are so crowded that they can't really mature to their typical or classic mature size. And in a sense, it helps for those overly thick, small trees to be diminished so that you get larger trees and more understory that isn't trees.
Well, it's my contention that fire suppression is a myth that the Forest Service promulgates. And there's a book called Tough Trip Through Paradise. I forgot who wrote it, but
Andrew Garcia.
Thank you. And it was written in the late 1800s, and he talked about riding through parts of the Northern Rockies, and he said the forests were as thick as a hair on a dog's back. And then Lewis and Clark, when they started going up over the Bitterroot Mountains, the forests were so thick that they'd ride their horses up Lolo Creek for part of the way, and they couldn't see any wildlife, and they had to shoot one of their horses so they weren't starving to death. And you can't blame that on fire suppression. The Forest Service hadn't existed yet.
Nope. Don't know how to do that.
There it is.
Eventually, I mean, it might take, half a century or a century or whatever. Fire is going to catch up with those thick forests.
I start off by saying you can't fireproof a forest. And
Exactly.
I talked about Jack Cohen, and he said that forests evolved through fire in the Northern Rockies, and they evolved through stand replacing fire. So all forests are going to burn, and the only place we can fireproof somewhere is right next to your home. And it looks like my time's up, so thank you very much. I appreciate it.